Welcome back. You're still watching The Breakfast Show with Nashwa Rashid and myself, Muhammad Abdel. In this segment, dear viewers, we shall talk more about Egypt's keenness to work and cooperate with African countries to exchange views and successful expertise so as to achieve mutual sustainable development. Of course, Egypt is the current president of the rotating EU presidency. We are going to talk especially about economic cooperation and integration, Egypt being the door to Africa and from Africa. Recently, Minister of Planning, Follow-up and Administrative Reform, Dr. Hala Saeed, affirmed Egypt's keenness again to work and coordinate with African countries in many fields. She pointed out that the Egyptian investments in Africa during this past year amounted to 1.2 billion US dollars, bringing the total investment in the continent to 10.2 billion US dollars, and African investment in Egypt about 2.8 billion US dollars. She also explained that Egypt is actively participating in the efforts to implement the Africa Development Agenda 2063 and seeks to intensify cooperation with African countries in various economic and development areas, especially under the current Egyptian presidency of the African Union, and to promote this cooperation and achieve African integration, again in the goal of achieving mutual sustainable development. In this regard, we are very glad, dear viewers, to welcome here in the studio Mr. Abdel Latif Wahba, and he's an economic journalist and in charge of cabinet affairs in several media outlets. Thank you very much, Mr. Wahba, for joining us. Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning, sir.
Good morning.
And let me start by talking about the Investment Risk Guarantee Fund for Africa established by Egypt. How far can this contribute in the idea of economic development, sustainable development, and also attracting more foreign investments? We're not only talking now about Egypt, we're talking about the whole continent.
Let us say first that Egypt, before any efforts tried in last years to regain its historic rule in Africa, especially as you know that we have a special fund in Ministry of Foreign Affairs to help the some or many African countries, especially in social development, in educations, in public utilities, to improve the standard of life. This is the main purpose, firstly, to regain our historic rule in Africa. With these steps also, Egypt launched many missions for the African countries like Ethiopia, like Kenya, and they helped them in many different fields like, for example, agriculture, irrigations,
the health
industry, health, and so education, and so on. This is on one hand. On the other hand, after you paved the way for your entry again in Africa, we declared and we hosted many international conventions for the African development or for development in African countries. As you know, we hosted the African investment in Cairo. I think maybe in coming few days also again African Forum for Investment hosted by Ministry of International Cooperations and Investment. And at the same time, after President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi took his positions as a chairman of the African Unity, he adopted a new agenda for the African country, not only to depend upon the Egyptian investment, for example, but how to attract the foreign direct investment to the African country. If you remember the international conventions of the G7, President Abdel Fattah al-Sisi participated. He called the international community to help and to compensate also at the same time the African countries, and to help them to increase the direct investment in African countries or African continent in general. And on the other hand, Egypt increased its direct investment from 2.5 or 2.8 billion dollars to about 10.2 in African countries. We have, although the political disputes between Egypt and Ethiopia, we have the largest foreign direct investment in Ethiopia. This is the role of the Egyptian leadership, how to regain our historic role in African continent.
Yes, indeed, Mr. Wahba. So, sir, how can the peoples of the African continent benefit from the openness in economic trade and investment relations between the countries of the continent, especially in the bilateral relations between Egypt and many African countries?
As you know, if the African countries manage to attract investment, this is of course will play an important role in curbing the unemployment rate in Africa. It will play also a significant role in decreasing the illegal migrations from the African countries to the Europe or to the other world. This is of course will help also to make the Egyptian-African relations more strong than the last decades we lost our role in some countries. I think it will be important also for to create new jobs, to modernize the public utilities in these countries. This will be a benefit for the African countries and also for the Egyptian companies working outside. We have the giant of the Egyptian companies like Arab contractors, for example, have many tenders in African countries, in Uganda, in Tanzania, in Nigeria. This is the soft power of the Egyptian policy to penetrate through the African market.
Right.
Talking about the African market and the Egyptian product and how far, what about the needs of the African consumer as well? Some countries achieved a lot actually in Africa, and some others still they need a lot of efforts. So if we are talking about productivity, talking about exchanging expertise, and also how to take benefit of their own needs, if we're talking about the Egyptian product as well.
As you know, after Egypt implemented the economic reform program, we followed a new plan in modernizing our industry according to the international standards and so on. This is of course give you advantage to go the African market, and as you know that the African continent is the largest market for any goods and commodities and so on. But you have to know that the African countries still depend upon some European countries, especially in their life, especially to the countries they conquered them before. They are still depend upon their donations in many fields. If we manage to gather the international funded institutions and so on, this is of course will inject more direct investment in the African market. This is on one hand. On the other hand, we have the important opportunity to go to the African market at the same time. Especially, we have a good political relations with many countries, and at the same time we modernized also our naval transportations. We are trying to create a new lines to some African countries because we suffered during the last decades from transportations and how to cargo for the African countries. Now some international institutions classified Egypt as the first economy in Africa just now. In last decades, for example,
Nigeria and
Nigeria and
South
South Africa were the giant economy in Africa. But now, I think according to the rating of Rand Merchant Bank, put Egypt as the first economy in Africa.
Actually, as the fastest economic growth in
the
region.
And the fastest economic GDP in Africa.
Right. Mr. Wahba, I want to talk about two specific fields. We all know, of course, about the Egyptian role when it comes to the health sector, medicine and drugs in Africa. But I want to ask about the banking sector and the IT sector, because Egypt is very well known in Africa to have a very solid financial system. Its banking system is very sound. And also the IT, we are one of the leaders in the region when it comes to IT and making very strong progress there. So how can African countries benefit from the Egyptian expertise, especially in the banking and IT sector?
According to the effort for creating the African trade zone, I think in their last conventions in Sharm el-Sheikh, they adopted a new policy to that Egypt will provide them with a technological missions in the for the African countries. This is, of course, to help them in banking sectors. This is number one, in health sectors at the same time. And I think we have the initiatives for some Egyptian banks like the Central Bank and also the National Bank of Egypt to open a new branches in some African countries. This is, of course, will encourage the transformations and also to facilitate the financial dealing between Egypt and the African countries, and at the same time will encourage the Egyptian producers and exporters to go to the African countries or African markets without the past difficulties they faced in their transformation and so on.
Right.
So if we're talking about the banking sector, and of course there is no investments without providing more facilities for investors.
Yeah, of course.
Let me also talk about offices for promoting the Egyptian product as well, because this is going to be a business cycle. And how far do we have, for example, sustainable exhibitions for Egyptian products in African countries, and how far the Egyptian product is reliable as well?
I think we need a quantum leap to pay attention for the African markets, especially that we are always responding to participate in the international exhibitions,
like what?
In
if
Europe.
we're talking about trade, for example, are we talking about textiles, talking about food industry? What are we talking about?
I think it will be important for the Egyptian producers to participate in the African exhibitions, local exhibitions in some countries, because we are interested in the international exhibitions in Europe and Asia and so on. This is, of course, would be a chance to offer your commodities, your productions, and so on. This is the most important point just now. They are discussing how to give the Egyptian producers and the industrymen and the businessmen to participate on all the African conventions, exhibitions, and so on.
Right. Sir, I think, and you mentioned earlier the role of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs when it comes to economic cooperation with Africa, that the embassies, our embassies there, might have a bigger responsibility. The commercial representative, not only the ambassadors, but the commercial attaché or representative or counselor, and so on. And maybe the African department at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs could have a bigger role there when it comes to promoting Egypt, promoting Egyptian products and so on.
Yeah, of course, because we are imported in our to have a representative in European countries. We neglected this point in in many African countries. We now I think they are revising how to activate the commercial representative, trade representative, tourism representative in some African countries, of course, because we are still depending upon the traditional market, dealing with the European market or with the Asian market, and we neglected all the African market in many decades. I think it is now, according to my information, that the cabinet adopted a new policy concerning dealing with all sectors with the African countries in trade and increasing the bilateral relations between all the countries, and also to appoint tourism representative in the Egyptian embassies.
Very important.
Right. If you are talking about the importance of having an entity or the establishment of a central bank for funding and providing all facilities to make sure, talking about the security and stability of the economy in general in the entire continent. In addition, definitely, if we're talking about the development and the investors as well, all this will take benefit of such establishment.
Yeah, of course, as you know, that Egypt at the same time, I think they adopted a policy how to make stability first, because without peace and stability in the African countries, you couldn't do anything anymore, like attracting foreign direct investment and so on. And also some territorial disputes between some countries. I think this is a threat for the African people, for the foreign direct investment in the African countries.
And Mr. Wahba, I think the thing you mentioned is that the lack sometimes it's in some areas of peace and security was a major reason why African resources have been drained throughout the years. I mean, for years we've been saying that Africa is one of the richest, if not the richest continent when it comes to natural resources. Yet the peoples of Africa are not living in accordance with the richness they have in natural resources. I know there's an agenda for 2063, there are other plans. Are we getting there? Do you think we will live to see the day when Africans really enjoy their own natural resources and not other countries or foreign powers? Or
Yeah, I think it depends upon the political will. And as you know, there is competitions between some international organizations to go to the African market. As you know that, for example, America created a body or entity to hold conventions for the African countries. Also, Latin America had the same. Also, China had an annual conventions for the Chinese-African relationship. This is, of course, because they know that the richest place in the world is the African countries for its natural resources and so on, and also they have the cheapest manpower and so on. I think it is important to adjust all the African policies and to unify also the financial rules between the African countries. This is, of course, to make them to face the international blocks and so on.
yes, so as to achieve the dream of seeing Africa where it belongs, where it should be. Thank you very much, Mr. Abdel Latif Wahba, economic journalist and in charge of cabinet affairs at several news outlets here in Egypt and outside of it. Thank you very much.
Thank
It's
you.
been a pleasure.
Thank
Good morning.
you. I love you.
Dear viewers, we'll be back, Nashwa and I, momentarily and talk about the second segment, the Islamic Museum of Arts. So please stay with us.